I was a Volkswagen employee at the time of the scandal. I had just been promoted to a more senior position in the research and development department, and I felt like I was part of something big. The company has always been seen as an example of innovation and quality, and I was proud to be a part of that. But if I had known what was coming, I would have resigned right away. The year was 2015, and the diesel car market was starting to feel the pressure. Environmental regulations were becoming stricter, and sales of diesel cars were declining. That's where it all started. As always, everything seemed perfect at first glance, but what I didn't know was that behind the facade of excellence, Volkswagen was willing to do anything to maintain its position. It was a well-kept secret, something that, when I began to realize, I felt as if the ground had disappeared from under my feet. The atmosphere within the company was tense. Meetings became more frequent, and as much as we tried to ignore it, everyone seemed to know something was about to happen. The pressure to improve results was overwhelming. Increasingly, I've heard rumors about special software being developed to optimize the performance of diesel engines during emissions testing. Of course, no one said outright what it was about, but the nervous smiles and uncomfortable glances between the engineers began to raise my suspicions. I, like many, wanted to believe that it was just talk, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. What made me really uncomfortable was the fact that while the company preached its commitment to sustainability and environmental responsibility, inside our offices and workshops, everything seemed to revolve around numbers. How could we sell more? How could we cheat the system? In a more private meeting, one of the directors mentioned something that has stuck with me to this day. If we can't adjust these emissions for the tests, sales will plummet. And there, as if by accident, the truth was revealed. The adjustment would not only be technical, it would be something much more obscure, something that could destroy the credibility of a global brand. Little by little, I began to see the magnitude of what was happening. Some colleagues started acting strangely. We knew the cars weren't meeting environmental regulations, but everyone, down to the last engineer, seemed reluctant to question it. The software, which no one really understood, was silently deployed to test units. He allowed cars to pass emissions tests, even though he knew that the amount of pollutants they released on the road was much greater. It was a fraud on a grand scale. And worst of all, we were all involved, directly or indirectly. I, who had previously been proud to work there, felt a mixture of anger and fear. The most disturbing thing was the feeling that at any moment, everything could fall apart. The tests were carried out by outsourced teams, and the idea was to keep the process isolated. The first time I heard about such manipulation was in an informal meeting with a colleague from a different department. He looked around, as if afraid someone might hear, and then said in a low voice, "It's all a lie. We're manipulating the numbers." What gave me chills wasn't so much the revelation, but the fact that rather than feeling surprised, a part of me already knew. I knew it all along. The tension only increased. Every day, more and more cars rolled off the production line, all equipped with that software that ensured they passed the tests. I felt like an unwitting accomplice, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. It was as if something inside me had been corrupted, as if the company itself had altered my perception of reality. The worst part is that no one seemed willing to stop. Anyone who raised their voice was quickly silenced, either by direct pressure or by the feeling of powerlessness in the face of such a large and impenetrable system. The final blow came just as emissions tests began to be revealed. The first investigations by environmental organizations began to indicate that something was very wrong, but for us, inside the company, it was only a matter of time before everything was hushed up. Deep down, I knew it was a bomb about to go off, but I preferred to continue deceiving myself. But it wasn't long before news of an impending scandal began to circulate. And that's when I saw a photo of a longtime friend who worked at Volkswagen being called to testify. The heart stopped. He was inside the investigation, and that meant everything was going to fall apart. I could no longer ignore what was happening. When the first headlines started appearing, it was like the ground had dropped out from under my feet. Volkswagen involved in scandal emissions test fraud, the headlines screamed, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. I knew what was behind it all, but seeing it exposed to the world was something else. Panic gripped the company. Emergency meetings began to happen constantly, with everyone trying to figure out how to mitigate the damage, but no one knew what to do. Some of my colleagues were visibly distraught, their faces blank, as if they had just realized how far things had gone. The truth, however, was something I could no longer ignore. There was no denying that the company was willing to destroy its own image just to keep profits high. The repercussions were immediate. Shares plummeting, the world press was on the case, investigations in several countries. But the most terrifying thing was seeing the faces of the people I used to call colleagues. Many of them were clearly guilty, but at the same time, they were desperate to escape the consequences. I was even called into a few meetings with lawyers just to clarify my position and ensure that I was not directly implicated. I was in shock, still trying to understand what all this meant for my personal and professional life. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The pressure was so great that I could barely sleep. The streets were full of protests, environmentalists, and even consumers who felt cheated, and I, inside the company, wondered how we could get to this point. More and more people were leaving the company, resigning, being dismissed, or worse, being investigated. Meetings that were once about innovation were now about collateral damage and attempts to clear the company's name. But honestly, I knew it was too late. The damage was already done, and Volkswagen would never be seen in the same way again. When the first former directors began to be arrested and the scandals continued to spread like a virus, a feeling of helplessness took hold of me. I tried to convince myself that I had no direct involvement, that I didn't know about the manipulative software, but the truth is that I knew. Maybe he didn't know all the details, but he knew enough to understand that we were all going down together. What hurt me the most was the fact that in some way I had been an accomplice to this lie, and that was something that to this day haunts me. What really devastated me was seeing people's reactions, not co-workers, but consumers, those who trusted the brand, who bought their cars believing they were making an environmentally responsible choice. The guilt I felt when I realized that on some level I had been a part of it all was overwhelming. I always believed that I was working at a company that cared about the future, about sustainability, about the world, but now looking back, I see that it was all just a carefully crafted facade to deceive everyone. Every time I saw a Volkswagen car on the street, I felt a lump in my throat, as if that lie was screaming at me. The worst, however, was yet to come. The media couldn't stop digging into more and more details, and each new revelation seemed worse than the last. The government and authorities were putting pressure on me. The lawsuits began to multiply. And with each new statement, I felt myself sinking deeper into this nightmare. Then one morning, as I was trying to piece together my professional and personal life, I received an anonymous email. It was short and to the point, but that was what disturbed me the most. The fraud was just the beginning. Prepare for what's to come. I never knew who sent that email, but at the time, a chill ran down my spine. Something told me that the worst was yet to come. It was that night that things began to take an even stranger turn. I was at home, alone, trying to understand what was happening to me and the company. The phone rang in the middle of the night. It was an unknown number, and the voice on the other end was hoarse, almost a whisper. You think it's over. This is nothing. What you saw is just a part of something much bigger. The phone hung up before I could respond. I sat in my chair, stunned, staring at the device as if I had just heard something coming from another reality. My heart was racing, and for a moment I thought it was some kind of nightmare, but it wasn't. In the following days, the feeling of being watched became even more intense. I didn't know if I was paranoid, if I was imagining things, but something told me I was being watched. I started noticing strange things, people in cars around my house, a shadow passing by the window when I was alone. Fear began to consume me, and the guilt wouldn't leave me alone. I could no longer distinguish what was real from what was not. I started to think that everything was connected, that email, that phone call, and the shadows around me were signs that I was about to pay the price for everything I knew and never revealed. I no longer knew who to trust. The investigations were deepening, and the effects of the scandal were felt around every corner. Some people began to disappear from the radar, as if the weight of guilt had caused some of them to vanish without a trace. Rumors had it that several people involved were being silenced, either by legal means or other more obscure methods. And then one night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a noise coming from my gate. I walked to the window, and what I saw froze me for a second. A car stopped, a figure standing next to it, staring at my house. There were no visible signs, but the feeling that he was watching me from somewhere was enough to make me lock all the doors and close the curtains. I knew things were going too far. Fear soon spread through my body like an electric current. Everything I did seemed to connect me to something bigger, something far more dangerous than any emission fraud. My fear became a constant companion, and the feeling of being watched never left me. I began to question my own actions. Could I have done something to stop it? Could there have been something more behind the manipulation, something even deeper and darker? The company, which was once a symbol of trust, has become a veritable fortress of lies and corruption. And I, in the midst of all this, no longer knowing if what was happening around me was real or a consequence of my own guilt, felt more lost than ever. The worst came when, at the height of the investigation, the police arrived at my door. It was a grey morning, and when I heard the loud knock, my stomach turned. I knew what that meant. The scandal was becoming increasingly personal. One of my former colleagues, who had been dismissed shortly before, had put me at the center of the investigation. He didn't mention me directly, but his statements suggested that I knew more than I was letting on. At that moment, my world fell apart. They wanted to know everything: the software, those involved, the secret meetings. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't have answers. I never knew everything, but I knew enough to be an accomplice in some way. Interviews, questions, sleepless nights. The feeling of being constantly on the edge of the precipice did not leave me. The company, which I respected so much, became a nightmare that I couldn't escape. I could no longer distinguish what was true and what was a construct of my own mind. I found myself in a maze with no way out, where the only thing I knew for sure was that the weight of guilt and fear was consuming me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted like a cornered animal, and that in the end there would be no escape. When the processes finally began to take a clearer direction, with those most responsible being called to account, the company fell apart in a whirlwind of scandals. Volkswagen, which had for so long been a symbol of innovation and trust, was now synonymous with deceit and despair. I saw friends and former colleagues being dragged out of their homes, their faces etched with shame and the weight of guilt. I myself, still with the nightmare haunting me, found myself far from everything, with my career ruined and my personal life in tatters. But as if fate wanted to torture me a little more, I still had to face the legal battle. It was a fight for my own dignity, for my survival, in the midst of a tragedy that I kind of helped to create. What scares me the most to this day is the fact that, after all the scandal and the consequent punishment, there are still so many things we don't know. The environmental damage, the financial impacts, and most importantly, the damage to public trust. This cannot be erased. What I saw in that period of my life will never fade from my memory. And yet, as much as I want to leave the past behind, it never leaves me. The fear, the guilt, the sleepless nights, these are scars that remain, no matter how much you try to bury them. And as much as I have physically distanced myself from Volkswagen, something inside me will always know that I was somehow part of something much bigger and much darker than I ever imagined. Today, what haunts me most is not the investigations or the scandals, but the feeling that I may never be able to shake this experience, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many attempts I make to move forward. There's always something that reminds me of what happened, the image of Volkswagen cars, the protests in the streets, the shame in the eyes of my colleagues. All of this is a living memory, which drags on like a constant weight. What hurts me the most, and what haunts me the most, is knowing that no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I wasn't directly involved, the truth is that all of us in some way were responsible. The company was a monster, and we, small cogs in a bigger machine, simply played our part. To this day, whenever I see news about corporate fraud or similar scandals, I get that lump in my throat. Something inside me trembles. I know that my story is not unique, that there are many other people who have gone through something similar. But somehow, my experience becomes even more visceral because I lived it from the inside, seeing it all happen up close. The deception, the fear, the guilt, they have become part of who I am now, and as the world moves on, I am left with only the memories of what was one of the biggest nightmares of my professional and personal life. And maybe, just maybe, that's what keeps me going, trying to understand what happened and somehow seek a redemption that may never come.